Greetings from Kyiv. This is the second day of the International Forum, Democracy in Action, Zero Corruption Conference. This is a top-level event organized without involvement of any oligarchs, instead through a joint effort of Ukrainian civil society and our international partners that are presented on our website, where you will also find our media partners. And the leadership in the event is with the Anticorruption Action Center and the Nova Europe Center, and other partners that have conducted special studies about hybrid threats to democracy. And specifically, we mean disinformation, lawfare, and systemic strategic corruption. Corruption is at the forefront of our two-day discussion. We are looking solutions to threats in Ukraine and beyond. In the EU and the United States, as the corruption is a cross-border phenomena, and when the money is stolen from a developing country, they end up on the bank accounts of the leading European and Western countries. So only by joining efforts and through a shared political will, we can combat corruption on the national and international arenas. This is the day 2. It's going to be a very intensive day, but before we start, let's look back at the yesterday's day. What happened here at the forum?
І закликаю всіх об'єднуватися, працювати разом, працювати спільно на благо країни, на благо нашої рідної батьківщини, адже іншого нас немає.
We do need the cooperation of the countries in the region. And I have discussed the issue, for instance, the issue of fighting smuggling in the Transition region. I've discussed it with President Zelensky, and I do count on Ukraine's support here.
Autocrats and oligarchs cannot concentrate power without concentrating wealth through illicit means. So our ability together to identify and expose that behavior needs to be at the heart of our support for democracy around the world.
We need to ensure open civic engagement for an enhanced transparency and oversight of anti-corruption reforms implementation. Civil society organizations and independent media are absolutely vital actors in this process.
In our interest is to again keep stability, develop and invest in prosperity, and invest in the reform elements in the country.
As you can see, amongst the participants of the forum, we have the highest level speakers: the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Moldova, Maia Sandu, highly esteemed guests from the European countries, the officials from different European institutions, and we are seeking a common answer to the threats, hybrid threats to democracy. We have 15 different panels. In the 2 days, we'll have about 10 blocks or so today. We've just completed a panel on the challenges to local communities and their contribution to combating corruption, and we'll continue to talk about lawfare and judiciary in transitional democracies and fair justice. It's going to be a combined panel that's starting in 30 seconds. Afterwards, we'll look at the threat of disinformation, global possible threats of disinformation. We present a number of interesting studies about the impact of pandemic, or how the narratives and propaganda myths have evolved in the pandemic. We'll see if there is any correlation. We will also talk about investigating trans-border corruption and siphoning illicit goods. We are hoping that Sytnyk, the director of NABU, will join us for the discussion to discuss how political corruption can be prevented through effective control of asset declaration. We'll talk to Alexander Novikov, who is the head of the NAPC, and we'll seek the answer to the question how to ensure resilience of democracy through elections. Olga Vazovska will moderate that panel on elections and democracy, and we'll have the oligarch and de-oligarchization panel, and it's needed as a facet on the discussion. And the day will conclude with the long-awaited conversation about the Nord Stream 2, which is an important factor affecting security of Ukraine and beyond. And right now, we transition to our panels dedicated to the lawfare and judiciary in transitional democracies. I'm giving the floor to the moderator of the panels, Halyna Chyzhyk, judiciary reform expert of the Anticorruption Action Center.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Halyna Chyzhyk. I am Judicial Reform Expert at Anticorruption Action Center, and for the next 2 hours, we will be discussing lawfare, strategic corruption, and judiciary in transitional democracies. First of all, I want to welcome our distinguished speakers. With me today are Mr. Gianni Buquicchio, the President of the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe. Good morning, Gianni. And Mr. Artem Sytnyk, the head of National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. Доброго ранку. So, lawfare. It has been defined as using law and legal systems against an enemy by damaging and delegitimizing them. But for the last few years, the meaning of lawfare, the concept of lawfare has changed, and now we refer to it as to hybrid threat to democracy, when weaknesses of legal systems are used by oligarchs, kleptocrats, and crooks to undermine democracy. Corruption, especially strategic corruption, corrodes democratic institutions and therefore also serves as a tool against democracy. Countries that attempt democratic transformation can be easily damaged by lawfare. Our enemies are using weaknesses of our institutions against us as a weapon. So, the question is, what should democracy do to defend itself? How can we strengthen our democracies and our institutions? I now invite Mr. Gianni Buquicchio to present his speech. Mr. Buquicchio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Halyna. Distinguished participants present here or online, I wish to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity of participating in this panel today. I will start by reminding that corruption is a scourge. It takes hold of the highest end of politics. It distorts the proper functioning of the state or international system. Corruption is a destroying factor because it blocks and kills reforms. It frustrates all effort. Corruption is an inhibiting factor because it paralyzes reform efforts in anticipation of the default. Corruption is a delegitimizing factor because when money and power are seen to benefit the few at the expenses of the many, this abuse of power corrodes public trust not just in politicians, but in the institutions and values in which we believe. Corruption is an undermining factor because it threatens the function of the state institutions and pushes towards extreme solutions, sometimes at odds with the Constitution. Corruption is a hindering factor because it hinders the protection of fundamental social and economic rights. It interferes with equality, with the right to fair trial, and with many other substantive rights. Corruption is an impunity factor because it shields criminals, notably grand corruptors, from sanctions and sends a message to the society that the system of accountability and responsibility is not fair, is not equal to all. It does not function. Finally, corruption is a corrupting factor because it encourages others to join the group of those who thrive on it. Grand corruption generates petty corruption. Preventing and tackling corruption and, at worst, state capture must therefore be a top priority for governments across Europe and the world. Corruption is generally divided into different categories. Petty corruption or bureaucratic corruption is the lowest form of corruption, typically involving low-level public servants or managers who abuse the limited authority of their position for personal gain. Petty corruption frequently involves the abuse of entrusted power in exchange for favors or small sum of money. Grand corruption refers to business leaders or criminals paying off key governmental functionaries or political parties in exchange for a favor in economic sector where high margins are at stake. In both cases, it is a process of grand greed and an attempt to be richer. Systemic corruption, also called endemic corruption, occurs when a public or a private organization establishes rules or norms of governance that permit or encourage corruption. There is also a new phenomenon, which you quoted, which is the topic of this panel, strategic corruption, which refers to corruption used as an instrument of national strategy. Here, according to the doctrine, corruption is backed and sometimes orchestrated by a state power for political rather than economic goals, or to advance a comprehensive authoritarian agenda with inseparable political and economic objectives. As you know, the Council of Europe was set up to protect human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Fighting corruption has become an increasing part of our work. GRECO, the Group of States Against Corruption, our anti-corruption body, has acquired a crucial importance, delivering clear indications of the path to follow to achieve public authority, public sector integrity. The Venice Commission has been very active on the fight against corruption because its mandate involves the reform of the state institutions, including the judiciary and the constitutional courts, and the appropriate setup and reform of new institutions, including anti-corruption bodies, which is a crucial aspect of this combat. The approach of the Venice Commission in the search for a systemic and institutional response to corruption in compliance with the principle of constitutionalism and the rule of law. This approach does not change when the challenge is grand corruption and when it is strategic corruption. The fight against corruption is a multi-target procedure. You cannot fight corruption by fighting corruption alone. You also need to improve good governance. If you improve good governance, you improve the opportunity for economic development, which reduces the temptation to corruption. The fight against corruption To fight against corruption, you need to strengthen the democratic functioning of all the institutions of the state. Single initiatives are destined to fail in the long term if they are not coupled with an overall reform. If short-term urgent measures are taken to address a corruption issue without considering their effect on the overall system, they are doomed to fail. What I mean to say is that any anti-corruption reform must be designed, assessed, and implemented against the background of the prevailing constitutional setup. The Constitution must guide the legislator, and the check and balances of the constitutional system must be preserved. The Constitution is the framework, and reforms must abide by it. This is what the constitutionalism commands, what the rule of law commands. An effective fight against corruption and respect for judicial independence and rule of law have to go hand in hand. There can be no effective fight against corruption without an independent judiciary and respect for the rule of law. Equally, there can be no independent judiciary and respect for the rule of law when corruption is pervasive. Anti-corruption reforms must not go against the Constitution for two reasons. First, they risk upsetting the balance among the institutions, weakening some of them or making others too strong. Governance becomes difficult, even impossible. Corruption creeps in instead of being shut out. Second, violating the Constitution destroys the legitimacy of the anti-corruption measures itself, and it destroys public trust in the commitment of the government to abide to the fundamental values of the state. There is never any good reason to violate the Constitution. Unconstitutional actions against another state institution, even if they are deemed to address a fundamental issue of corruption, may not be conducive to solving any crisis. To the contrary, they weaken the state, erode public trust, open up to more corruption. The judiciary as an institution must be respected. Its judgments must be executed. The independence of judges must be protected. Judges should be accountable to the public through a system of disciplinary and criminal responsibility. They should enjoy only functional immunity, but they must not be accountable to the executive or to the legislative. Claiming to address an issue of corruption when the judiciary, by subjecting judges to the executive or to the legislative powers, is a misleading answer to the problem. A corrupt judge may be removed, but the loss of independence will be beyond repair. The same is true for constitutional courts. Constitutional courts play an essential role as gatekeeper of the Constitution and its values, and as the arbiter of separation of powers. Constitutional courts and their decisions must be respected. A decision that dissatisfies Parliament or the government, or is unpopular with the public, does not amount to abuse of power or to arbitrariness. Constitutional courts must enjoy public confidence and also the confidence of the other state institutions. Confidence does not imply lack of independence. On the contrary, a constitutional court may only enjoy the trust of the other state institutions and of the public if it is truly independent. Trust needs to be earned, but it can only be earned within a system which respects the Constitution and the rule of law. Constitutional courts sometimes do issue problematic decisions. We are all well acquainted with the October judgment of the Constitutional Court of Ukraine. But even when they appear to be arbitrary, these decisions of the Constitutional Court are final and binding under the Constitution. And as such, they need to be respected. They cannot be disregarded. In its opinion on the October judgment requested by President Zelensky, the Venice Commission suggested manners to do so, while preserving the anti-corruption mechanism. The Commission analyzed the judgment and found that it presented several flaws. The court had not respected its own procedure, and some of the judges had been in a possible conflict of interests regarding the outcome of the case, since the accuracy of their own declarations had been challenged by the anti-corruption bodies. The court decision was poorly reasoned and interfered without proper justification with the powers of the parliament to define crimes and establish liability for them. The poor quality of the judgment gave significant leeway for Parliament to follow the judgment in principle, thus paying due respect to the institution while interpreting it in a manner which was consistent with Ukrainian constitution and legal order, including the international obligations to fight corruptions. We were pleased to see that our recommendations were useful and were followed, and today Ukraine's anti-corruption bodies have been restored. In order to prevent the possibility of further tainted judgments with such an adverse impact on the legal system of Ukraine, the Commission also suggested that the rules governing the Constitutional Court require improvement. The Commission therefore recommended in a second urgent opinion, also requested by President Zelensky, on the one hand, to improve the system of declaration and recusal of judges in cases of conflict of interest. On the other hand, the Commission considered that it is imperative to improve the manner of selection of the Constitutional Court judges. It therefore recommended introducing a screening body for candidate judges of the court, with an international component which could include international human rights experts and participations from the civil society. It also reiterated that constitutional judges should be elected by a qualified majority in the Rada. Institutions must be preserved, and in order to do so, tainted judges must certainly be punished and, if necessary, dismissed. International law requires that a system of asset declarations should be in place and that it should be supported by appropriate deterrent penalties. These penalties need to be proportionate but severe. The Venice Commission, in its recent opinion, has welcomed the reintroduction of imprisonment for up to 2 years for the most serious cases of inaccurate asset declarations. Draft law number 4651 was adopted a few days ago. The amended version, however, has replaced deprivation of liberty with restriction of liberty. Further, property of the relatives of public officials has been removed from the duty of declaration and from the responsibility of the public officials. These are negative amendments which the Venice Commission does not support. For this reason, I appreciate the President's intention to veto this law. As concerns disciplinary procedures, dismissal is the most severe sanction, but all these measures may only be taken at the end of the appropriate procedures carried out by the competent institutions, notably high judicial councils. But can these institutions be trusted to carry out this crucial task impartially and efficiently? This is a dilemma. Bestowing guarantees of inamovibility of corrupt judges creates a potential of impunity on which corruption thrives even more. In this context, the Venice Commission reminded that the re-establishment of the High Qualification Commission for the Judiciary is urgent. The opinion welcomed the proposal to establish a mixed national-international body, the Competition Committee, for the selection of the new members of the High Qualification Commission. The method of establishing the Competition Committee should remain close to the successful model of the Anti-Corruption Court. It also stated that the High Qualification Commission should not be merged or submitted to the High Council of the Judiciary as long as the latter is not reformed and vetted. Unfortunately, Law 3711, as adopted in the second reading on the 28th April, does not meet the Venice Commission recommendations, and we do not support it. The High Council for the Judiciary needs to be vetted before it is entrusted with the setting up of the High Qualification Commission for the Judiciary. This is imperative, or the judicial reform will be doomed. On this last point, the Venice Commission issued another urgent opinion a few weeks ago on draft law number 5068, which aims to establish an ethics council for a period of 6 years to screen candidates before they can be elected or appointed as members of the High Council of Justice, and vetting the current members of the Council. The opinion welcomed the trust this draft law intends to reform the High Council. This opinion also welcomes the participation of international experts in the Ethics Council. It is indeed the strong opinion of the international community, including the Venice Commission, that mechanisms with an international membership component are capable of ensuring an objective approach to the choice of the candidates or to the imposition of sanctions. Bringing in an international component raises the question on the weight of the votes. In its latest opinion on the High Council of the Judiciary, the Commission recommended as a rule for votes that normally decisions of the Ethics Council should be adopted by at least 4 of its 6 members, including 2 international experts. In case of a tie, the vote would be repeated, but then the group including at least 2 international experts should prevail. The prevailing weight of the international component should be recognized also for the Competition Committee for the High Qualification Commission for the Judiciary. This option is difficult for the state and for the judges to accept, but we strongly believe it is necessary. This is why I would encourage the judges to be patient and engage in this process of building a public trust. It is a necessary evil to combat the scourge of corruption without generating instability and more corruption. Is this compatible with the international standards? It is, if it is done in a manner that conforms to the Constitution. For example, vetting under draft law 5068 would be a mere recommendation to the appointing bodies, including the Parliament, the Judiciary, the Bar, universities, etc., to dismiss the relevant member. The decision would stay with the appointing bodies, even though there is an expectation they will follow they will follow the recommendation. And if they don't, they would be accountable to the public. For how long should the international component stay? It should clearly be limited in time. I would say that when there is a clear, there are clear signs that national and international members act in the same super partes manner, ending the system may be envisaged. Ladies and gentlemen, I will conclude by saying that I do not underestimate the complexity of fighting corruption. By no means is any of the above easy to implement in practice. As I said, this is a multi-target action. I would add that it is a multi-actor action. Corruption within the judiciary must be fought by the decision makers, by the law enforcement agency, but also by the judges and prosecutors themselves, by the parties to the proceedings, by the lawyers, by the civil servants which operate in the courts, by the media, by the civil society. I don't overlook the urgency of fight corruption, the impatience to achieve results, but the expectations must remain realistic. We should promote a cultural change in politicians, in the judiciary, in the law enforcement agency, in the society. If the whiles may be blown, if the whiles is blown, impunity for grand corruption might commence to decline. It would be a good beginning. Thank you very much.
Mr. Buquicchio, thank you for this remarkable speech. I cannot say how close your words are to my heart. Really, independent judiciary is a pillar of a democracy. We need to combat corruption, to defend our democracy and make our judiciary truly independent. The essential part of this fight against judicial corruption is the reform of Judicial Council. And we are incredibly grateful to the Venice Commission for its opinions on the reform of the High Council of Justice and High Qualification Commission of Judges. We are convinced that international experts should have a decisive, temporary but decisive role in the process of reform of the High Council of Justice and High Qualification Commission of Judges. Otherwise, the reform will be doomed. So now I promise you, as a civil society of Ukraine, we will do our best to make sure that Venice Commission recommendation on judicial reform are implemented. And now I'll switch to Ukrainian. Отже, пане Артеме, пан Buquicchio свій виступ почав зі слів про те,
Mr. Buquicchio started his remarks
що
by saying that preventing and combating corruption, and especially countering the attempts to capture the state, must become a top priority for European governments and governments worldwide. You lead one of the key anti-corruption institutions in Ukraine. Has fighting corruption become indeed our top priority? What tools do we have to tackle strategic corruption? Are we willing to share our experience with the other countries? You're welcome. Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, thank you for having me, for being a part of this crucial discussion. Lawfare and using legal acts and sometimes intentional ignoring laws has been characteristic of Ukraine as a transitional democracy. But this issue became even more urgent over the last 2 years. Let me explain. Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine was created back in 2015. We started investigating judges and top officials having major power. When Anti-Corruption Court was established, these investigations finally translated into convictions. Yesterday, the director of state-owned enterprise was convicted, and another conviction vis-à-vis the judge was issued yesterday. The system was in place. And we have seen what is mentioned in the topic of our panel, using the laws or sometimes intentional ignoring of the legal basis. Mr. Buquicchio mentioned the Constitutional Court. I stand with him. The Constitutional Court must be the decisive body guarding the balance of powers, deterring certain authorities from usurping power. Over the last 2 years, things that happened in Constitutional Court can hardly be named aimed at ensuring balance. These decisions could hardly be named legitimate. When anti-corruption system started working, the Constitutional Court immediately basically blocked all that effort, nullified it. One of those decisions was repealing the liability for illegal enrichment. The anti-corruption bodies investigated top officials of state institutions. This investigation ended up in court, and after the conviction was issued, then the liability was cancelled. After the reboot of NACP, National Agency for Corruption Prevention, we have seen that this important authority was limited in powers. During current people in power, their orders appointing the head of this agency was overturned. And in the district Kiev Administrative Court, there was a notice of suspicion that was issued to one of the justices, and the Constitutional Court repealed the notice. There were over 20 attempts in the parliament to limit or restrict NABU's powers, or to get its management to be dismissed or to resign. And the international partners and the civil society had the time to respond to those challenges. In the Constitutional Court, the procedure is concealed. It happens overnight, in secret, and in the morning we read the decision taken not only within the country, but international experts are assisting us for a number of years to do the judicial reform. We were investigating when the oligarch and NABU relegated some of the materials to the court, but then the Constitutional Court wanted to deprive NABU of this power. It's heartwarming that our international partners are now a part of that effort. This must be stopped, because the reforms, if ever successful, are likely to be immediately stifled by the Constitutional Court. And there is one more case in the Constitutional Court regarding Anti-Corruption Court. So the institutional anti-corruption system is under threat of liquidation. I am a leader of one of the anti-corruption bodies, and one of my major concerns is the use of other courts to block certain investigations. The Anti-Corruption Court was established with the participation of international experts. And those who were involved in anti-corruption bureau cases faced a problem. They couldn't ensure a positive outcome from themselves, beginning with the detective and ending with the judges of Anti-Corruption Court, who started convicting people, confining people, and those were the long-awaited outcomes of the reform. And this underscores the importance of judicial reform, a comprehensive reform, as opposed to creating a separate non-corrupt court. There were cases regarding top officials, and they neared Anti-Corruption Court. Several, even sometimes successful attempts took place. Through Petr's court, they tried to take those cases away from the Anti-Corruption Court to make sure there's no conviction coming. This has no legal basis. This is the offense of the law by the court of the first instance. This is an example of leveraging administrative power. These efforts have somewhat abated now, but people were using a mechanism that is totally outside the legal basis. These cases were indeed taken from NABU relegated to other investigative bodies. And then those investigators were effectively blocked, and we don't know what the outcome of this investigation is. It's paramount that these days the Constitutional Court problem is addressed, because the balance of power in the state will be upset unless it's done. Judicial reform started years ago, and you participated in it, and we have cooperated to that end. But the reform is sadly not completed. So things now are probably even worse than they were back when we started. Therefore, taking into account the latest 7 years, successful selection procedures, successful reforms are linked to the participation of international experts. I mean, where international experts participated in the selected committee. SAPO, where international experts also participated. And I mean HACC, where thanks to international experts, we could recruit people into this crucial and critical court, judges who were really willing to do this work. As justice is administered, HACC judges are under constant pressure from the non-reformed High Council of Justice. Therefore, justice reform needs to be advanced further. Judiciary self-government needs to be involved, and without it, the success is uncertain. It's hanging by the thread, the whole architecture is threatened. This success is extremely fragile, and it can be challenged, because we see that the judges face an enormous amount of pressure as they administer justice. Which brings me back to disciplinary proceedings. Judges could be punished, but only lawfully, and this should be the disciplinary proceeding. So, coming back to your point, I also want to mention the Naftogaz state-owned enterprise reform. This was a pain point, always. But when international experts entered the supervisory board of this state-owned enterprise, this company now makes profit. And this SOE has suffered a blow, but I do hope it's reversible. Reforming the authorities happened thanks to the national component. But what can we call a success? Only those where international experts, international technical experts were involved. People who are competent, who have the background, who can impartially assess the integrity of the candidates running for the selection procedure. I do hope in the nearest future the Parliament will pass the necessary legislation addressing the gaps created by the decisions of the Constitutional Court and other judges of Ukraine. After this change takes effect, I hope the selection procedures would not last for ages. Just to give you an example from Special Anti-Corruption Prosecution Office, we have seen that it takes almost a year to hold that competitive selection. And this process is basically now suspended, and there's no end in sight. Artem, sorry to jump in. So basically, we can say that involving international experts in reform and in judicial self-government reform is our decision. We know this is a demonstrated success story. It has a good track record, and we are convinced that it's going to work for the other regions.
Again, we are deeply honored to welcome you here today. Thank you for your remarkable speeches. Let's keep moving in this direction on defending our democracies and searching for new solutions to modern threats. Thank you very much.
If you allow me, I would like to say 3 words.
Yes, please.
After what Artem said, I agree with him. The judicial reform must be comprehensive. The Venice Commission and the Council of Europe are working on the judicial reform in Ukraine for decades already without a real success. We are going piece by piece, but it must be an holistic reform of the judiciary. Second thing, the anti-corruption body must be safeguarded at any cost because they've done a good job and they must continue to do their job. Vetting the High Council of the Judiciary and selecting new good members is a priority. Also, the High Qualification Commission is a priority, but the two are interlinked. And I think this is much more important that the Council of the Judiciary is vetted and reformed in order to then to select good members for the High Qualification Commission. Although this is also very urgent because you lack 2,000 judges in Ukraine, and next year you will have 1,700 more who will be retired by then. It's to say that the judiciary will operate with half of its personnel. So all these issues are urgent, and what I hope that the government, the parliament will do is to accelerate these reforms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I cannot agree with you more. So let's do our best to make judicial reform in Ukraine a success story this time. Thank you very much.